What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets late-night television's sharpest tongue in a collision that nobody saw coming? You won't believe what unfolds when Sylvester Stallone sits down with Stephen Colbert, and what starts as standard celebrity banter transforms into an absolute powder keg of accusations, political fury, and raw emotion that ends with one of the most dramatic exits in talk show history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in ways that will leave your jaw on the floor. Last night's Late Show with Stephen Colbert was supposed to be a celebration of Stallone's illustrious career, promoting his latest project and reminiscing about the Rocky franchise that made him a household name. Instead, viewers witnessed something unprecedented, a complete meltdown between host and guest that started with subtle jabs and escalated into a full-blown confrontation that had the studio audience sitting in stunned silence. The tension was palpable from the moment Stallone walked onto the Ed Sullivan Theater stage. While the audience erupted in their usual enthusiastic applause, something felt different. Colbert's trademark grin seemed forced, his usual warmth replaced by something colder, more calculating. Stallone, wearing a dark suit and his characteristic confident swagger, took his seat beside Colbert's desk, but even his legendary composure couldn't hide the slight tension in his shoulders. "Sylvester Stallone, everybody!" Colbert announced, his voice carrying its typical theatrical energy. But those watching closely could detect an underlying edge. The Italian stallion himself, here to talk about his new project, and hopefully not punch anyone tonight. The joke landed with scattered laughter from the audience, but Stallone's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, and for a brief moment, the famous Rocky smile faltered. "Well, Stephen," Stallone replied, his gravelly voice carrying a hint of warning, "I only punch people who deserve it." The audience laughed harder this time, assuming it was playful banter between two entertainment professionals. They had no idea they were witnessing the opening shots of what would become one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Colbert leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, studying his guest with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. "Speaking of punching, Sly, can I call you Sly? I've got to ask about some of your recent comments regarding the current political climate. You've been pretty vocal about your support for certain candidates and causes that, well, let's just say they're not exactly popular with everyone in this room." The studio fell noticeably quieter. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity chat that audiences expected. Stallone shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly. "I think every American has the right to express their political beliefs, Stephen. That's what makes this country great. The freedom to speak your mind without being attacked for it." "Oh, absolutely," Colbert replied, his tone dripping with false agreement. "Freedom of speech is sacred. But when you use your platform, your massive influence, to promote ideas that many consider dangerous or backwards, don't you think that comes with a certain responsibility?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun. Stallone's knuckles were white as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Dangerous? Backwards?" His voice rose just enough for everyone in the studio to notice. "Stephen, I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've played heroes, I've inspired people, I've given everything I have to entertain audiences. And now you're sitting here in front of all these people calling my beliefs dangerous?" Colbert's smile never wavered, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully lit a fuse. "I'm not calling anything dangerous, Sly. I'm simply asking if you think there's a difference between Sylvester Stallone, the entertainer, and Sylvester Stallone, the political commentator. Because when Rocky Balboa talks politics, people listen." "You're damn right they listen," Stallone shot back, his legendary composure beginning to crack. "And maybe that's what bothers you. Maybe you can't handle the fact that not everyone in Hollywood thinks the same way you do. Maybe you're so used to your little echo chamber here that you forgot there are real Americans out there with different opinions." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Audience members exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether they were witnessing an elaborate bit or a genuine confrontation. Colbert's producers, visible in the wings, looked increasingly worried, making subtle gestures toward their host. But Colbert was just getting started. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the condescending tone that had made him both beloved by supporters and reviled by critics. Real Americans, you say? That's interesting phrasing, Sly. Are you suggesting that those who disagree with your political views are somehow less American? Because that sounds pretty divisive coming from someone who built his career playing a character that represented unity and perseverance. Stallone's face flushed red, the color creeping up his neck like a rising tide. Don't you dare twist my words, Stephen. Don't you sit there and lecture me about what America means when you spend every night on this show mocking half the country. You want to talk about divisive? Look in the fucking mirror. The profanity hit the studio like a thunderclap. The audience gasped audibly, and Colbert's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Oh my," he said with exaggerated shock. "Looks like we're going to need to bleep that out. Sorry, folks. Sometimes the mask slips and we see what's really underneath." But Stallone was past the point of caring about television decorum or public relations. The man who had portrayed some of cinema's most beloved underdogs was now fighting for something more personal. His reputation, his legacy, his right to exist in a Hollywood that seemed increasingly hostile to his worldview. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and what happened next would push both men far beyond the boundaries of typical late-night television. What followed next was a complete breakdown of the usual Hollywood pleasantries that viewers had come to expect. Colbert, sensing blood in the water, decided to go for the jugular with surgical precision that would make his political commentary segments look tame by comparison. "You know what I find fascinating, Sly," Colbert continued, his voice now carrying the cold edge of someone who had abandoned all pretense of civility. "You built your entire career playing the underdog, the guy who fights for the little people. Rocky Balboa, John Rambo. These characters stood up against corruption, against systems that crushed ordinary Americans. But now, here you are, defending politicians and policies that do exactly what your characters fought against." Stallone's hands clenched into fists on the armrests of his chair, the same hands that had thrown countless screen punches now trembling with barely contained rage. "You don't know what the hell you're talking about," he snarled, his famous Philadelphia accent becoming more pronounced as his anger mounted. "Those characters, those stories, they came from me, from my heart, from my experiences. You think you can sit there and tell me what they mean? I think I can read the subtext." Colbert fired back, leaning forward with the predatory instinct of a comedian who had found his target's weakness. Rocky fought Apollo Creed, then became friends with him. He showed that Americans could overcome their differences. But the real Sylvester Stallone seems more interested in building walls than bridges. Kind of ironic, don't you think? The audience was now completely silent, the usual laughter and applause replaced by an uncomfortable tension that made the studio feel like a powder keg waiting to explode. Camera operators adjusted their positions, sensing that whatever was happening between these two men was far beyond the scripted banter that typically filled late-night television. Stallone stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech that echoed through the silent studio. At 6 feet tall and still powerfully built despite his age, he cast an imposing shadow over Colbert's desk. "You want to talk about walls, Stephen? Let's talk about the wall you've built around yourself. The wall of privilege, of elitism, of thinking you're better than everyone else because you went to some fancy college and learned how to make jokes." Colbert remained seated, but his posture stiffened. "I went to Northwestern, Sly, not Harvard. And I earned everything I have through hard work, just like you supposedly did. The difference is, I don't use my success to punch down at people who have less." "Punch down?" Stallone's voice rose to a near shout. "I came from nothing, Stephen. My father was a hairdresser. My mother was an astrologer. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with 3 other people. I wrote Rocky in 3.5 days because I was broke and desperate. Don't you dare lecture me about punching down when you've never had to fight for anything real in your entire privileged life." The raw emotion in Stallone's voice seemed to catch even Colbert off guard. For a moment, his carefully constructed persona flickered, revealing something more human underneath. But it was only a moment. "That's a beautiful story, Sly," Colbert said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Really touching. But success has a way of changing people, doesn't it? The guy who wrote Rocky in a cramped apartment is now defending tax cuts for billionaires and policies that make it harder for the next generation of broke, desperate writers to achieve their dreams. Stallone took a step closer to the desk, his imposing presence making several audience members visibly uncomfortable. Security personnel, usually invisible during tapings, could be seen moving closer to the stage area. "You're goddamn right, success changes people," he growled. "It taught me that hard work pays off, that America is still a place where dreams can come true if you're willing to bleed for them. But you? Success just made you cruel. It made you think you're some kind of moral authority who can judge everyone else from your ivory tower." "Ivory tower?" Colbert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I do a comedy show, Sly. I make jokes. You make movies about solving problems with violence and then wonder why people criticize your politics. Maybe the problem isn't the tower I'm sitting in. Maybe it's the cage you've built around your own mind." That was the breaking point. Stallone's face went from red to purple, veins bulging in his forehead as decades of frustration and resentment came pouring out. "You smug son of a bitch," he snarled, pointing a finger directly at Colbert's face. "You sit here night after night, hiding behind your jokes, never having to face any real consequences for the poison you spread. You mock people's beliefs, their values, their way of life, and then act surprised when they fight back." Colbert stood up now, finally abandoning his casual posture. At 6'3", he had a slight height advantage over Stallone, but none of the actor's physical presence. "I mock ignorance, Sly. I mock hypocrisy. And right now, I'm looking at a perfect example of both." The studio erupted in gasps and nervous murmurs. This had gone far beyond entertainment. This was personal, ugly, and completely out of control. Producers in the wings were making frantic gestures, trying to signal for a commercial break, but both men were too locked in their confrontation to notice or care. "Ignorance?" Stallone's voice cracked with fury. "Ignorance? I've lived in the real world, Stephen. I've struggled. I've failed. I've gotten back up and fought again. What have you done except read jokes off a teleprompter and congratulate yourself for being so fucking clever?" The profanity hung in the air like a challenge. Colbert's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack, his face flushing as Stallone's words hit their target. "At least I don't pretend my entertainment is something profound," he shot back. "At least I don't wrap my ego in the American flag and call it patriotism." That was it. That was the final insult that would push this confrontation into territory that no one in the studio was prepared for. Stallone's entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing as if he were preparing for a physical fight. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have. "Don't you ever question my patriotism, you piece of shit. Don't you ever." The studio fell into complete silence. Even the cameras seemed to stop their subtle movements as everyone present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Colbert, despite his height advantage, actually took a step back as Stallone moved around the desk, closing the distance between them. "My patriotism?" Stallone continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've spent 50 years celebrating this country through my work. Rocky, Rambo, every character I've ever played has been about the American spirit, about never giving up, about fighting for what's right. And you make a living tearing it all down." Colbert tried to regain his composure, straightening his tie and forcing his trademark smirk back onto his face. "Oh, please, spare me the righteous indignation. Your movies are jingoistic fantasies that solve complex problems with simple violence. That's not patriotism, Sly. That's propaganda wrapped in flag-waving bullshit." The words hit Stallone like physical blows. His face contorted with a rage that went beyond anything his most intense screen performances had ever captured. "Jingoistic? Jingoistic?" His voice boomed through the studio, causing several audience members to flinch. "You arrogant fuck! Those fantasies inspired millions of people. They gave hope to kids who had nothing, showed them they could fight back against impossible odds. What has your cynical, bitter comedy ever inspired except more division and hate?" Security personnel were now moving closer to the stage, but they seemed unsure how to handle a situation involving two high-profile celebrities who were clearly beyond reasoning with each other. The show's director was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling. sensing that whatever was happening would be talked about for years to come. Colbert's mask was slipping completely now, his carefully constructed persona cracking under the weight of Stallone's assault. You want to know what inspires me, Sly? Truth inspires me. Holding people accountable inspires me. Not letting aging action stars wrap themselves in nostalgia and pretend their outdated worldview is still relevant. Aging? Stallone laughed, but it was a sound devoid of any humor. Cold, bitter, and dangerous. You think this is about age? This is about respect, Stephen. Something you clearly never learned. I've earned my place in this industry. In this country. I've paid my dues with blood, sweat, and tears. You've earned yours by being a smartass who thinks being clever is the same as being wise. The two men were now standing less than 3 feet apart. The tension between them so thick it was almost visible. The audience sat frozen, watching what felt less like entertainment and more like a potential prelude to violence. Wisdom? Colbert spat, abandoning any pretense of his usual measured delivery. You want to talk about wisdom? Here's some wisdom for you. Just because you played heroes doesn't make you one. Just because you wrote inspiring dialogue doesn't mean you understand what it actually means. You've become everything your characters would have fought against. That was the final straw. Stallone's control, already hanging by a thread, snapped completely. That's enough, he roared, slamming his fist down on Colbert's desk with enough force to make the coffee mug jump. I don't have to sit here and take this shit from some failed comedian who thinks he's a political commentator. Failed comedian? Colbert's voice rose to match Stallone's volume. I've won Emmys, Sly. I've interviewed presidents. I've built a career on intelligence and wit, not on punching bags and steroids. The steroid comment was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Stallone's face went from purple to nearly black with rage. Steroids? Steroids? You son of a bitch, I worked my ass off for every muscle, every role, every achievement. While you were probably getting participation trophies in debate club, I was training 18 hours a day, getting rejected by every studio in Hollywood, until I created my own opportunities. And now look at you, Colbert shot back, his voice dripping with contempt. A relic from a bygone era, desperately clinging to relevance by aligning yourself with politicians who wouldn't know a real American value if it punched them in the face. The irony of the phrase wasn't lost on anyone in the studio, least of all Stallone, who took another step closer to Colbert. For a moment, it seemed like the legendary actor might actually throw a punch, turning their verbal warfare into something physical. Instead, Stallone straightened up, his breathing heavy but his voice becoming eerily calm. You know what, Stephen? You're right about one thing. Some things do deserve to get punched in the face, but you're not worth bruising my knuckles over. He turned toward the audience, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to see what happens when Hollywood's elite think they can tear down anyone who doesn't march in lockstep with their agenda. Colbert, sensing that Stallone was about to leave and wanting to get the last word, couldn't resist one final jab. Running away, Sly? That's not very Rocky-like. Stallone stopped dead in his tracks, slowly turning back toward the host. The smile that spread across his face was perhaps more frightening than his earlier rage had been. You know what Rocky would do in this situation, Stephen? He'd walk away. Because sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to play a rigged game. He began walking toward the studio exit, but his voice carried clearly as he delivered his parting shot. The difference between me and you, Stephen, is that I've spent my career building people up, and you've spent yours tearing them down. History will remember which one of us was right. The studio remained in stunned silence as Stallone reached the edge of the stage. He paused one more time, looking back at Colbert, who stood behind his desk looking simultaneously defiant and shaken. Oh, and Stephen, Stallone called out, his voice now carrying a hint of the old Rocky charm that had made him famous. Next time you want to take on a fighter, make sure you're ready for the fight. With that, Sylvester Stallone walked off the Late Show stage, leaving behind an audience in shock, a host struggling to regain his composure, and a moment of television that would be dissected and debated for years to come. The confrontation that had started as typical celebrity banter had devolved into something raw, personal, and utterly unprecedented. A collision between two worldviews that had been building toward this moment for years, finally exploding in spectacular fashion on live television. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras finally stopped rolling, one thing was certain: late-night television would never be quite the same again.